Findan Hertog, the director, first approached me about it because I was looking for a copy of An Enemy of the People in relation to another project. It felt kind of, I was sort of loosely aware of it, and I'd read it before years ago, and it felt kind of relevant to this other thing that I was writing. So I think it was on Facebook, actually. I asked if anyone had a copy of it that I could borrow, and Finn noticed this, and obviously he'd been thinking about it and been thinking about an adaptation, and saw that I was thinking about the same play, set up a meeting, and approached me about the idea of adapting it. So the idea actually came from Finn in the first instance, and not from me. This was 2016, and so we just had the Brexit vote, and Trump had just been voted in America. And it's important to understand that in the original play, the original Ibsen play, you have this character at the heart of it, Dr. Thomas Stockman, who is coming home to the small rural Norwegian spa town where he lives to take up a position at the local baths, which is the centre of the town's economy. And he finds a poison in the water and takes this information to his brother, the mayor. And he expects that this information will be welcome and that everyone will want to shut everything down immediately. And he's met with a very different response, and he becomes a bit of a pariah. He becomes the enemy of the people of the play's title, not a hero at all. And so you had this thing going on in the play that was sort of like something to do with a kind of expert knowledge from a kind of doctor class, a kind of social elite, a kind of scientific principles of rationality and reason and proof and evidence, but held in a kind of expert way by an elite class, kind of pitted against popular will, and a kind of politically manufactured popular will. So the mayor turns the people of the town against his brother because he doesn't want to have to shut down the baths because the town's economy will be destroyed, and therefore so will his political career. So, long-winded way of saying, in 2016, when this country had just voted for Brexit, or rather the UK had just voted for Brexit, and America had just voted in Trump, this thing about popular will versus elite experts and a kind of what at the time was getting called the kind of metropolitan elite, if you like, felt really timely. So it felt like there was something interesting there. So that's why we looked at that. And then we kind of noticed, well, there's actually all this interesting stuff to do with the media there as well. In the 19th century, in a small town, that's very much about the local press. And Ibsen gets this whole act. The original is a 5-act play. And Ibsen gets this whole act out of this question of whether or not the local paper are going to publish the doctor's article that contains this information. And we were looking at that, kind of going, well, how do you adapt that? And, well, because these days that's just done in a second, like in a flash. He could just go online and publish it on the internet. So that led us to think about the media and how it functions in the 21st century in relation to these themes, in relation to popular will, in relation to democracy, in relation to truth. And we thought, well, there's actually something really interesting here about taking the story and the themes of this play and putting it in a 21st century context right now, where you can speak to very current questions of populism, of the nature of truth in a digitized age, of social media and how that affects these debates. So that was it. That was why. That was the why of it. So we kind of cobbled together a pitch document and took that to various people, including the NTS, who gave us a bit of support to develop the script, and that's how that happened. So in some ways, our adaptation of Ibsen's play stays very, very true to the original. It follows the main sort of beats, if you like, of the story really quite closely. It really tries to honour the kind of central thematic discussion of Ibsen's play and just put that in a new context. But in other ways, we've had to make massive changes. So the play now is set, or our play, is set in a small deindustrialised Scottish town. The gender of the two leads is reversed. There's one particular character called Aslaksen who's very, very different than he is in the original. And a lot of the characters have been shed. Ours is an hour and a half straight through with a cast of 6. So there's been some big, big changes, but a lot of those changes are actually, they come from trying to most accurately translate through the geography and time the original story. So, for example, why is it set in this deindustrialized town, and why is it having this massive conversation about regeneration to do with the Big Splash Resort and all that? Well, the original is set in a rural Norwegian sort of spa town that is famous for the life-giving properties of its water. And that's why that's central to its economy. Now, that needs to be central to its economy for the story to work, because a poison is found in the water and the mayor says, absolutely not, people can't find out about this. So as in the earliest stages of adaptation, you're asking yourself, well, what is the equivalent in Scotland that can make that work in Scotland in the 21st century? And the first thing we thought of was maybe it's fracking, right? Maybe there's a small town and fracking has come in. But it just didn't land right at all because there's too much popular opposition to fracking. That it just didn't make sense that everyone would be like, boo, like frack our town, frack our town. That didn't make any sense. So you're kind of scratching away for what this equivalent of this 19th century town is, and there isn't one. There isn't a town in Scotland that is famous for the life-giving properties of its water, so the equivalent that we could land on is you take a small deindustrialized town that maybe used to have industry but hasn't had much since about the 80s. Towns like that all across Scotland. We recognise that in Scotland. And instead of there being this baths, there's a really top-down regeneration project happening where loads of money is being invested into the town, government money, private money, to build this massive Trump Turnberry scale indoor beach resort that's going to transform the economy of the town. And the people have been convinced that this is a good idea because it's going to bring jobs and dignity. And suddenly that begins to work. The story can happen there. So it means that we have this whole conversation in the play that isn't in Ibsen's play about the nature of regeneration in the 21st century, about the power dynamics of that, about the politics of that. But the reason we're doing that is because that's the closest analogue we could hit upon for what's going on in the original. So it looks really different, but it's actually about an attempt to repurpose something of the original in a new context. Ali Aslaksen, the character in The Enemy, the character that he's drawn from in the original is a guy called Aslaksen, who is the president of the Homeowners Association and the chair of the Temperance Society. So he is someone who commands huge amount of influence over the voting population of the town. Now, Ibsen plays him as a bit of a comedy figure because he plays him as this very dull bore, this man with very traditional good Christian values, and is very much not a socialite at all, a very dull, boring, good, honourable man. But he commands influence. He commands influence over the town because of his status as the president of the Homeowners Society. So for his position in the story to make sense, he needs to be someone who commands influence over the voting public, who commands influence over the population. And for us, that was just he's a local celebrity. In a small town like this, you sometimes have local celebrities that become big media personalities or musicians. Maybe he was on Pop Idol or Fame Academy or something. Do you know what I mean? And they command influence because people are proud of them. And in the 21st century, in the world of social media, they often maintain careers through their own channels and through their own platforms and become essentially a social media influencer. So our Ali Aslaksen is the polar opposite of Aslaksen from Ibsen's, but that's not just because we want to make some kind of funny contemporary gag about influencers. That's because in Ibsen's play, there's a character whose role in the story is to command a huge amount of influence over the public. And that's who he is. And so for us, we just needed a different version of that. Similarly with the social media stuff, we're not just trying to be contemporary and relevant and quirky or whatever by showing tweets on stage. It's just if we're going to talk about how people are vilified in the public eye, how a person who was seen as a hero can quickly be seen as a villain, then there's no way to have that conversation in the 21st century in the UK without it being about getting cancelled online. That's just a huge part of it. It's a huge part of how opinion functions. So all of these kind of super relevant things in the play are not really attempts to be relevant for the sake of it. They're genuine attempts to address what's happening in Ibsen's play and repurpose that for the context that we find ourselves sitting in the theatre in now. So that's what's going on there. Putting on like a literal translation of the Ibsen now would be a really valid thing to do. It's just not what we were doing. We were writing a new play, telling a new story set in a small town in Scotland now. And the way that I've always approached the language of the characters, how they speak, I'm just writing how people speak. I'm writing how people have always spoken around me. People often ask me about swearing in my plays, and it always catches me a little bit off guard because I'm not trying to do some kind of like bolshy, edgy thing. This is just how people always spoke all around me when I was growing up. If young people start asking me about that, why is that going on, then maybe that's something worth me listening to. Maybe the ways young people, teenagers are speaking are changing. You know, I'm 35 now, maybe it's different. But for me, with Petra dropping all the see you next Tuesdays, then like, she speaks like that because for her to not speak like that would be unusual for me. And so it would be a very conscious decision for me to make her not speak like that. So what am I doing with that decision? For me, it would be a case of if the whole script came out with no swear words at all, that would be an unnatural language. That would be not how people speak, in my experience, especially not how people speak when they're under immense pressure, which you hope to at least sometimes find them in when you're writing a drama. So, like, for me, if the thing was entirely free of swear words, that would be the question. Like, why that? Because that's an odd and unnatural and highly stylized decision around how to speak. I guess with Petra, there is maybe an element, if I'm being honest, of a little bit of shock value there that is about, but it's to draw out something of the story. It's to draw out something of who she is in this. There's a gag at the top, because the play is littered with jokes as well. I'll come back to that in a minute. But there's a gag at the top of the play in the first scene where she drops a C-bomb and it shocks her mum, and she makes the point that that's just how people speak here. Now, there's a bit of a truism that in Scotland, people can use that word in a way that is much more relaxed and informal and almost just like punctuation than it is received in other parts of the English-speaking world, like in England and America or whatever. It's about drawing out that gag, which is an opportunity. You're trying to set up so much in the first scene. You're trying to tell the audience so much about who these people are, but you're trying to do it in a way that doesn't look like you're telling them about who these people are. So it's an opportunity in that scene to draw out a little comment from Petra as she's speaking to Kirsten about her efforts to try to fit in, about her status as an outsider, about the fact that they've recently moved. And you do that with a joke. You know, you sort of play it as a joke so that it's a laugh, so that it doesn't feel like expositional dialogue. So yeah, maybe in that instance, the kind of like having the character use that word early on in the play is a bit of a deliberate choice to draw out a reaction, but it's part of an attempt to tell the story. It has a function. Similarly, it's also setting some of the terms. One of the things you're also trying to do in the first scene is establish some of the rules of the performance. And again, and not in a too heavy-handed way, but so that the audience kind of go, okay, I see what's going on here, I understand what this is, and they're with you. So it was really important that we had a text message appear on screen in the first scene, so that when that comes 20 minutes later, it's not like, what's this? Similarly, it's really important for me to drop a C word in the first scene, because then people that have come thinking, now the marketing handles most of this, but then people that have come thinking, have come to see Ibsen, you know, or maybe kind of just gently told, well, you're seeing something a bit different, actually. And that's like a choice. There's a choice there to like guide the audience with that. Earlier, I spoke about me and Finn kind of developing a pitch and taking that to various people, eventually taking that to the National Theatre of Scotland, who were interested in the ideas there. The next thing that happens there is they give me what's called a commission to write the play. But before that, because this was an idea that began with Finn and began with very much in a conversation between the writer and the director, between me and him, it felt quite important to maintain that. So actually, before I went away to write the script, which is something I did, me and Finn spent a week together in a room here at NTS with translated version of the original, and we did a lot of big paper on walls, mapping things out, drawing things out. And so there was a lot of like conversation with him about the kind of piece we were making, so that there was a kind of shared perspective and shared vision over what it was we were doing before I went off to write. So when Finn gets back a play that was, I mean, it runs at an hour and a half. The first draft of the script probably would have ran at 2 hours, but when Finn gets back a play that's essentially one long play straight through, no interval, not breaking down into acts like the original was, only 6 characters. Petra is now a 16-year-old as opposed to an adult woman. In the original, Petra's a teacher. When he gets all of these mad changes, they're not a surprise to him. That's not something that I've just gone away and done and he's like, this isn't what we're doing. So that's an important part of the process between a writer and a director on a task like this, if the director's already in place, which he was in this instance. After that point, there's a process of writing and rewriting. If you're working professionally as a writer without doing other things, then you've probably got a few other projects on the go, so it can take a while. Rosie Kelliger here at National Theatre of Scotland, who's the literary manager or dramaturg here, would feed back notes from the team, from herself and the team, so you'd get kind of organisational notes back, you'd get some notes back from Finn, you'd go away and do another rewrite, and that's the kind of process for a little while, until we all agree that we've got a script. In and through that process, it's worth saying, there was 2 very significant moments of R&D with actors in the room. Now, R&D is what we call research and development time, right? So that's, we're not in rehearsals yet when we're doing R&D. We're exploring the play and exploring the project with a bunch of other collaborators and peers and co-workers, and that will include actors, but also it'll include the beginnings of the design team maybe. People are coming round for a table read and beginning to develop ideas. All of this is happening before we're going into rehearsal, so that there's something that's beginning to grow there. And as a writer, you learn loads about what it is you've done in those periods, because especially as a writer for performance, a writer for theatre, what you're doing as a writer isn't ever complete on the page. So you can work away between you and the page for ages and ages and ages. But the words it's only ever complete when it becomes someone's breath. You're writing for something that happens in space and time and in 3 dimensions. And you can learn so much more about it by hearing it aloud. Actors understand plays much better intuitively than writers do. So you do the R&D with the actors, you make lots of cuts, you find out that you don't need this thing or that thing or that thing, or a whole bunch of stuff that I was explaining earlier about trying things out in scene 1 to do something. You're like, well, actually this one didn't work and that did work and that. So you're editing and rewriting as you go, until eventually you have a script that we're all happy to go into rehearsal with. Then, at that process, if it's a new script like this one, often what's going to happen is you're going to get a whole load of more rewrites in the first week of rehearsal, because you're still in that process of finding out more about it as it becomes 3-dimensional, as it becomes a big living, breathing thing. And as other elements come into play later on in the process, you have 4 weeks rehearsal normally, that's what we had for this process, and then you go into Tech Week. And then Tech Week is when we start moving out of the rehearsal room and into into a theatre space, and we start building all of the bells and whistles of the show. So the lighting design comes, the set is now, the actors are working on the set, the lighting design is moving from being something abstract and theoretical to something real, and it's all coming to life. Even then, you end up finding out things that you don't need anymore, or things that change slightly because just the way it works in the space is slightly different. So there's a kind of fine-tuning editing going on right until the last minute, and the actors need to be real pros about that, because that's really challenging for them. So the actors were getting line changes after first preview. So first preview is the first time that we show the work to a paying audience. So it's in many ways opening night. The tickets are cheaper and it's called a preview, and we don't have press in yet, but you have people paying money to come and see the work. So you're live, you're go. After first preview, some of the actors are still getting line changes. So it's a constantly evolving thing, and then there just comes a point when, if anyone ever reads the published play, if you get a copy of the published play, you can play a game of spot the difference between what's in your hand because that is where the play was at when the hard publishing deadline just had to happen. The publishers have their own deadlines. They need to get it to the printers, they need to get it back from the printers, and time to get it to the theatre to be able to sell it as a programme text. So they have their own deadlines, but the editing that happens on the play keeps happening after that point. So you will always find a difference between what you heard on stage that night that you were in the theatre and what's in your hand if you're coming to see a brand new play. Not always. If you're coming to see one of mine, always. So yeah, that's the process, really.